The loudest person in the room is rarely the most powerful. This observation becomes clearer once you understand how power actually moves through human systems. Real power operates through subtlety, positioning, and calculated silence. It does not need validation from the crowd because it already controls the conditions that determine what the crowd sees. Most people misread power entirely. They assume it announces itself with grand gestures, expensive displays, or aggressive dominance. They look for the person giving orders, making speeches, or demanding attention. But this approach reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of how influence actually works in human hierarchies. The person who needs to tell you they are in charge usually is not. True authority rarely feels the need to explain itself because it has already shaped the environment in which decisions are made. It operates through what appears to be natural flow, inevitable outcomes, and coincidental circumstances. Consider how this plays out in corporate environments. The executive who constantly reminds people of their title typically holds less real influence than the advisor who simply appears in key meetings, speaks briefly, and whose suggestions somehow become policy. The difference lies not in formal authority, but in how power chooses to express itself. Power that announces itself creates resistance. When someone loudly proclaims their control, they invite challenge. They position themselves as a target. Every declaration of dominance becomes a dare for others to test that claim. This is why the most effective power structures prefer invisibility to spectacle. People often confuse noise with strength. They see someone shouting orders and assume that person controls the situation. But volume frequently indicates the opposite. When someone must raise their voice to get compliance, it suggests their authority is not naturally recognized. It suggests they are working against the current rather than directing it. The psychology behind this is straightforward. Humans naturally defer to power they perceive as legitimate and natural. They resist power they perceive as forced or artificial. The moment power has to justify itself, it becomes artificial. The moment it has to demand recognition, it becomes forced. Watch how this dynamic unfolds in social situations. The person who constantly name drops, discusses their achievements, or references their connections is typically compensating for a lack of actual influence. Meanwhile, the person who speaks little but whose words carry weight operates from a different position entirely. This distinction becomes more apparent when you observe which person others gravitate toward for actual decisions. The insecure often mistake the quiet observer for the irrelevant participant. They focus their attention on whoever creates the most verbal activity, assuming that voice volume correlates with decision-making capacity. This misallocation of attention serves the interests of those who understand how influence actually flows through human networks. This pattern appears consistently across different contexts. In negotiations, the party that talks the most usually holds the weaker position. In relationships, the person who keeps explaining why they deserve respect typically receives the least. In business, the company that advertises its power most aggressively often has the most to prove. There is a practical reason why power prefers subtlety. Announced power creates accountability. When someone publicly claims control over outcomes, they become responsible for those outcomes. If results fail to materialize, the proclaimed power becomes obviously false. This exposure weakens future claims to influence. Quiet power avoids this trap. It can claim credit for positive outcomes while distancing itself from negative ones. It maintains plausible deniability. It preserves the option to retreat or advance based on circumstances, rather than public commitments. This flexibility becomes crucial when operating in environments where conditions change rapidly. The most effective power structures understand that perception often matters more than reality. They focus on creating the impression of inevitability rather than broadcasting their capabilities. They make their preferred outcomes appear natural, logical, and spontaneous rather than imposed. This approach reduces friction and increases compliance. This works because human beings prefer to believe they make autonomous choices. People resist obvious manipulation but accept subtle influence. They reject commands but embrace suggestions that feel like their own insights. Power that announces itself breaks this illusion and triggers resistance. The art lies in maintaining the recipient's sense of agency while guiding their conclusions. The workplace offers clear examples of this principle. The manager who micromanages and constantly asserts authority typically generates more friction than results. Every instruction becomes a negotiation. Every deadline becomes a battle. The leader who sets clear expectations and allows others to fulfill them creates smoother operation with less visible effort. In both cases, control exists. But in the first scenario, the control is obvious and therefore challenged. In the second scenario, the control is embedded in the structure and therefore accepted. The difference lies not in the amount of power, but in how that power presents itself. The embedded approach appears less controlling, while actually exercising more control. Social media has created new ways for people to misunderstand this dynamic. Platforms reward loud self-promotion and constant declarations of success. This creates an illusion that power operates through announcement and display. But these platforms measure attention, not influence. Attention and influence often move in opposite directions. The person with millions of followers may have less real power than the person with a carefully curated network of key decision makers. The individual posting about their achievements may have less actual control than the person whose name appears in no public forums, but whose preferences somehow shape multiple outcomes. This gap between visibility and influence continues to widen as digital metrics become mistaken for actual capability. This distinction becomes important when evaluating where real power exists in any system. The visible figures often serve as distractions from the invisible structures that actually determine outcomes. The public faces may have less control than the private advisors whose names never appear in press releases. The ceremonial positions may hold less authority than the operational roles that remain unnamed. There are psychological reasons why humans struggle to recognize quiet power. We evolved in small groups where dominance was typically physical and obvious. Modern power structures operate through abstract networks, institutional influence, and systemic positioning. Our instincts lag behind the reality of how contemporary hierarchies function. This lag creates opportunities for those who understand how power actually moves. While others compete for visible positions and public recognition, the truly strategic position themselves in places where they can influence outcomes without drawing attention to their role in creating those outcomes. They understand that the most valuable positions are often the least visible ones. The legal system provides another clear example. The most powerful lawyers often do not appear in court. They work behind scenes, crafting strategies, advising clients, and shaping the conditions under which visible advocates operate. Their influence determines what happens in the courtroom without their ever needing to argue a case publicly. They control the game rather than playing it. Similarly, in politics, the most influential figures frequently hold no elected office. They operate through think tanks, advisory roles, and informal networks. Their ideas become policy without their names becoming public. This allows them to maintain influence across different administrations and changing political climates. They survive transitions that eliminate more visible figures. Financial markets demonstrate this principle at scale. The most powerful market movers rarely make public statements about their positions. They accumulate and deploy capital quietly, allowing their actions to speak through price movements rather than press releases. Public declarations would only create resistance and reduce their effectiveness. They prefer outcomes to announcements. This extends to information networks as well. The most influential sources of information often operate through intermediaries. They shape narratives without appearing to author them. They influence conversations without participating in them directly. They control the agenda while remaining absent from the discussion. People often mistake the absence of announcement for the absence of power. They assume that if someone does not claim credit, they deserve no credit. This misreading creates blind spots that strategic minds exploit. While others chase recognition, the truly powerful focus on results. While others perform strength, the strategic accumulate capability. This does not mean that all quiet people hold power, or that all loud people lack it. The distinction lies in understanding when silence serves strength and when it serves weakness. Confident power can afford to be quiet because it does not need external validation. Insecure power often becomes loud because it craves that validation. The difference lies in the underlying position, not the volume of expression. The key insight is that power itself has no inherent need to be recognized. Its value lies in its effects, not in its acknowledgement. Recognition can actually diminish power by making it accountable to others' expectations and subject to others' challenges. Anonymous power faces fewer constraints and generates less opposition. Modern education and media often promote the opposite message. They suggest that success requires self-promotion, that influence demands visibility, and that power must be claimed publicly to be real. This messaging serves systems that benefit from having power concentrated in predictable, visible, and therefore controllable places. It creates a competition for ceremonial positions while actual power operates elsewhere. Those who understand how power actually operates can use this misunderstanding strategically. While others exhaust themselves in public competitions for status, the strategic focus on building actual capability and positioning. While others announce their intentions, the strategic shape outcomes. While others seek applause, the strategic seek results. The most sophisticated power structures create the illusion that power lies somewhere other than where it actually exists. They promote visible figureheads while maintaining control through invisible channels. They encourage public focus on ceremonial positions while conducting real business through informal networks. They provide spectacle while executing strategy. This pattern repeats across industries, institutions, and social structures. The apparent decision-makers often implement decisions made elsewhere. The public faces often represent interests that remain unnamed. The credited individuals often serve functions determined by uncredited architects. The system operates through misdirection and misattribution. Understanding this dynamic changes how one evaluates any situation involving human hierarchies. The question becomes not who appears to hold power, but whose preferences consistently become reality, not who gets credited with decisions, but whose logic shapes how decisions get made, not who speaks the loudest, but whose voice creates the most lasting impact. The implications extend beyond simply recognizing where power exists. They suggest different strategies for building and maintaining influence. Instead of competing for visible authority, one can focus on creating conditions where preferred outcomes become inevitable. Instead of claiming credit for results, one can ensure those results align with longer-term objectives. This approach requires patience and strategic thinking. It means accepting that immediate recognition may be less valuable than sustained influence. It means choosing substance over appearance, positioning over performance, and effect over credit. It means building foundations rather than constructing facades. Most people lack the patience for this approach, which is precisely why it remains effective. The timing of power reveals much about its nature. Announced power often operates on short timescales. It needs quick validation and immediate results to justify its claims. Quiet power can operate on longer timescales. It can plant seeds that mature over years, create conditions that produce inevitable outcomes, and shape environments that generate desired behaviors without ongoing intervention. This temporal dimension explains why loud power often burns out quickly while quiet power endures transitions and changes. The announced leader must constantly prove their relevance. The invisible influencer simply ensures their preferences become embedded in how systems operate. One requires energy, the other creates momentum. Technology has amplified both the opportunities and the challenges of quiet power. Digital systems can multiply the reach of subtle influence while creating new forms of visible performance. The same tools that enable anonymous impact also reward public display. Understanding which aspects of technology serve strategic invisibility versus performative visibility becomes increasingly important. The most effective operators in digital environments often maintain the smallest public profiles while exercising the greatest influence over information flow, network connections, and systemic outcomes. They understand that digital noise can mask digital signal, that public attention can distract from private action. Once you understand why power rarely announces itself, the noise of those who do announce their power becomes less impressive. Their very need to make such announcements reveals the limitations of their actual control. Their desperation for recognition exposes the weakness they are trying to hide. Their performance becomes transparent once you understand what to ignore. This understanding changes how you interpret most human interactions. The person demanding respect likely receives the least. The individual claiming expertise probably possesses the least. The authority insisting on recognition probably holds the least. The pattern becomes predictable once you know what to observe. The academic world demonstrates these principles with particular clarity. The most influential researchers often publish less frequently than their visible colleagues. They focus on work that shapes entire fields rather than generating constant output. Their ideas propagate through others' work, creating intellectual movements without requiring personal recognition. University politics reveals similar patterns. The professor who dominates faculty meetings typically holds less actual influence than the colleague who serves on key committees and whose recommendations consistently determine outcomes. The visible performer often distracts from the quiet architect. International relations operate through this same logic. The most powerful nations exercise influence through economic interdependence and institutional positioning rather than military display. They create conditions where other nations find certain behaviors beneficial, making their preferences appear like natural choices. This indirect approach proves more sustainable than direct coercion. Military intervention creates obvious targets and generates resistance. Economic integration creates dependencies that feel voluntary while serving strategic objectives. Cultural influence shapes preferences at their source rather than constraining behaviors after they form. Religious and ideological movements follow similar patterns. The most enduring belief systems spread through personal conviction rather than public evangelism. They influence behavior by changing how people interpret experiences rather than demanding specific actions. They become part of how individuals think rather than external rules they follow. Consider how certain ideas become common sense without anyone remembering their origin. These concepts achieve influence precisely because they no longer require advocates. They operate as background assumptions that shape subsequent thinking. This represents the ultimate form of ideological power, influence that has become invisible to those it affects. The entertainment industry provides contemporary examples of quiet power. The most influential figures often work behind cameras, controlling what stories get told and which messages reach mass audiences. Directors may receive recognition, but producers often determine which directors get hired and which projects receive funding. Music industry executives shape culture through decisions about which artists receive promotion and which songs get radio play. Their preferences become popular taste without audiences realizing they are being guided toward specific choices. This dynamic appears in technological development as well. The most transformative innovations often emerge from research that received little public attention. The scientists who create foundational breakthroughs typically remain unknown, while entrepreneurs who commercialize their work become celebrated figures. The internet demonstrates this principle at massive scale. Digital platforms exercise enormous influence over information flow and social interaction while maintaining the appearance of neutral infrastructure. They shape what billions of people see and think without appearing to impose specific viewpoints. Search algorithms determine what information people find. Social media algorithms determine which ideas spread. Recommendation systems determine what people watch and purchase. These systems influence human behavior at unprecedented scale while operating through seemingly objective technical processes. The architects of these systems wield influence that exceeds most traditional forms of power, yet they remain largely invisible to those affected. Their preferences become embedded in technological infrastructure that shapes daily life for billions. This represents perhaps the purest form of quiet power, influence exercised through environmental design. Professional services illustrate these concepts on smaller scales. The most successful consultants often work with multiple competitors within the same industry, shaping strategic thinking across entire sectors without appearing to favor any particular organization. They influence market dynamics through cumulative effect rather than visible partisanship. Investment advisors and strategic planners often wield significant influence over business decisions while maintaining low public profiles. Their advice shapes how leaders think about problems and allocate resources. The legal profession demonstrates sophisticated applications of quiet power. Corporate law firms often represent multiple parties to the same transaction, helping structure deals that serve their institutional interests while appearing to serve clients' individual needs. Regulatory capture represents another form of this dynamic. Industries often exercise more influence over their regulators through informal relationships and shared assumptions than through direct lobbying. Financial networks exemplify quiet power operating at global scales. Central banking systems coordinate monetary policy across nations through informal consultation and shared frameworks. Their decisions affect billions of people, yet their deliberations remain largely invisible. Private financial institutions exercise similar influence through collective behavior. When major banks simultaneously adopt similar lending standards or investment strategies, they create economic conditions that shape entire markets. Educational institutions play crucial roles in perpetuating quiet power structures. Universities shape how future leaders think about problems across sectors. The curricula and frameworks taught in professional schools determine how graduates approach challenges throughout their careers. Business schools, law schools, and policy programs create shared intellectual frameworks that influence decision-making long after students graduate. These institutions shape professional cultures without appearing to advocate for specific ideologies. They influence through methodology rather than content. Research funding patterns represent another layer of quiet influence. Grant-making institutions shape knowledge creation by determining which questions get investigated and which methodologies receive support. Their priorities become research priorities without requiring explicit direction. These patterns reveal how quiet power operates across scales from individual interactions to global systems. The consistent principles include preference for indirect influence over direct control, sustainability over immediacy, and structural integration over performative display. The implications for individual strategy become clear once you recognize these dynamics. Competition for visible positions often distracts from building capability. Pursuing recognition frequently reduces real influence. Announcing intentions typically generates resistance that makes outcomes less likely. More effective approaches focus on developing expertise that creates natural authority, building relationships that provide access to decision-making processes, and positioning oneself where preferred outcomes become inevitable rather than requiring constant advocacy. The observer who understands why power rarely announces itself gains significant advantages in navigating complex systems. They can identify where real influence exists rather than where it appears to exist. They can build actual capability while others pursue ceremonial positions. Most importantly, they can recognize the difference between performance and substance, between announcement and achievement, between visibility and influence. True power moves like water, finding the path of least resistance while ultimately reshaping the landscape through which it flows. It accumulates in low places, operates through indirect routes, and changes everything it touches without needing to announce its presence.